Welcome to Elevate Ed for SC, a video podcast series exploring education transformation in South Carolina. I'm your host, Rashonda Pratt. If you believe that it's time to elevate the conversation from traditional reform ideas and move to real transformation, then you're in the right place. In this series, you'll hear success stories of how education transformation is already happening in some South Carolina schools. The vodcast first season will tell stories, raise questions, and look at solutions. Some radical and some right in front of us. We look forward to sharing these stories with you. The sponsor of this vodcast is All for SC, a University of South Carolina initiative that's leading the way in advocating a whole child approach to education. We're coming to you from the Kennedy Greenhouse studio on the U of SC Horseshoe. In this episode, we turn our conversation to what transformation can really look like. Our first guest is one of our regular contributors, Barnett Berry, a research professor and senior director for policy and innovation at U of SC's College of Education, who developed and launched All for SC. Barnett, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you again, Ro.
Glad to have you here. You talk frequently about how we need to approach education through the lens of a whole child approach. Does that mean we need to look at education as more than just what happens while kids are in the classroom?
Absolutely. And if I could even get our viewers and listeners to think about something pretty powerful, think about the very best kindergarten class you've ever seen or experienced, hopefully with your own child. And think about, for those who've gone to graduate school, to think about the experience you have in earning a master's and doctorate degree and the relationships that exist between the teacher, the student, and the content to be learned. They're indelibly linked. We have some of the best whole child approaches in our midst right now. We just don't have a system of whole child education in South Carolina yet, nor does any other state for that matter. We need to work on this.
You said something in our first episode that's very thought-provoking. You said that people frequently said that they want education reform, but no one wants schools to look any different than when they went to school. What do you think about that?
Well, there's a whole lot of both sociological and educational research that really pinpoints of the perceptions of both educators as well as parents and the public writ large, that they like schools as they currently are. They may want them to get better. But just like when they go to church or synagogue or wherever we might worship, people like to go sit in their own pew, right?
Right.
Week after week. They like that stability. They like that institution to have that stability for them. Well, same thing with our schools. And I will tell you this, if we really want major changes and improvements in our school system and delivering on whole child education, then we have to change how we operate schools and how they work with other partners, both in and outside the public sector as well as the private sector.
Change can be very uncomfortable for people, and when you talk about sitting in the same pew, I have a tendency to do that at my church, right? So what I'm hearing you say is we have to change our mindset about how we view education. How do we even begin to start doing that and embracing this whole child approach?
Well, I think first and foremost, we've got to really illuminate the bright spots of whole child education already in place in South Carolina. We've got to help people learn about them. We've got to collect more evidence on how they're beginning to happen. And then we've got to really push policy, particularly around funding and governance and accountability.
Right.
So many of those policy pieces hold us back. It keeps us in the old system that, by the way, was designed for the industrial age. We're now well into the third decade of the 21st century, and we still have school systems operating like they did in the 1950s and the 1960s and the 1970s.
So if we had to give someone something practical, we know the first start is listening to this vodcast to be educated about this. But then how do you take this and make it a tangible thing? What's the first step for parents, educators, or those who are just listening?
Well, I think we got to get really clear about what we mean by whole child education. You know, imagine first and foremost if we had really good information on every child.
Right.
Their academic, their cognitive, their behavioral, their social, their emotional, their mental needs and strengths. And what if we had really good data systems, which, by the way, we're beginning to build, but then create time for teachers to work with allied professionals, folks in the after-school world, How do we help them work with those other professionals who are supporting kids after 3:30 in the day to bring all of it together in what we call a whole child education system? Imagine if every child going through middle and high school and beyond have these apprenticeships and internships around the future of work. Imagine if we had teachers working on different sort of schedules where they could have time to work with these allied professionals. We can do this because bits and pieces of it are already in place in South Carolina.
So you're a researcher and you work as a professor in the College of Education at U of SC. I have to ask you, why are you so passionate about whole child approach education?
Well, two things. One, this is my home state. I've just returned after being gone for about 20 years, so it means a lot to transform the system in the place where I was born and reared. That's first and foremost. Plus, in my work over the course of 35 years, I've come to learn, both through others' research and my own, that schools alone cannot close the opportunity and achievement gaps that we are facing right now.
Right.
And in case of the pandemic, that has deepened those inequities. If we continue to operate schools in the ways that we have in the past, we're never going to catch up and accelerate learning for kids. The stakes are very, very high, Ro. It's time to really take transformative action.
Transformative action, if you could name one thing or highlight one thing, what would transformative action look like for you?
It would mean changing the school calendar and bell schedule.
Oh, I know my kids would love that.
Yeah, more flexibility for kids to come at different parts of the day. Schools open more than from 7 o'clock in the morning to 3:30 in the afternoon. Schools as hubs of the community, and bringing resources from not just our education sector, but the social service sector, the health sector, and bringing those resources together to support schools as these hubs of community, more than just the 7:30 to 3 o'clock day for kids.
When you talk about this school bell schedule, I find this to be very interesting. In your research, have you found educators who are open to changing the school bell system?
Oh my gosh, yes. And there's some marvelous examples across the country and around the world, but also there's some here right here in South Carolina that we can draw upon. It's just that we don't have a system and we don't have the funding and governing approach that allows us to get to scale. Most educators really want to do this, but they are running pretty hard and fast right now, having to operate in a very archaic system that was designed for a bygone era.
I love the fact that we have educators who are part of this conversation, and I love getting their perspective. Barnett, thank you so much. You've given us a lot to think about. And in our next segment, Barnett and Christina Melton, another of our regular contributors, digs more into the role of teacher leadership in transforming our schools. In this segment, Barnett and I welcome Dr. Christina Melton, a former district superintendent and classroom teacher. All4SC has been involved with a research project to study the experiences of teachers on the front lines, thanks to a grant from the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Let's bring Christina into the conversation to give us some perspective on what we're hearing from district teachers of the year and nationally board certified teachers throughout this ongoing research. Christina, can you give us some examples of what you're hearing?
Oh, I would love to. And first I need to tell you, as a principal, former principal and teacher, I have to give you context because I can't just tell you a piece of the story.
Yes.
I got to tell you the story. In November or the fall of 21, there was a conference where Teacher of the Years were invited from across our state. Over 70 districts were represented at this conference. Our team was able to have some representatives attend to interview teachers, and they were so honest with us. And if you don't mind, I'd like to share a few things. I actually want to honor their words, because they took the time to share with us personal stories, to let us in their everyday life, to share ideas with us. So rather than me summarizing, I'd rather us have a chance to hear directly from them. One teacher said, "I'm not talking about simple situations. I'm talking about kids going hungry. I'm talking about kids being abused at home." Another teacher said, "Let's talk about what we can do together for kids outside of our classroom." A third teacher said, "I have a child that is sleeping in class because she's not sleeping at home. She sleeps in my class every day." But this teacher goes on to describe, "I let her sleep. When she wakes up, it's lunchtime and she's hungry. So guess what I do during lunchtime? This teacher writes, we sit, we eat together. But that's when I teach her, is while she's eating, because that's when she's paying attention and can learn with me.
Wow.
Then the teacher goes on to describe just how many people are involved with personnel from the school involved with this child's situation. This is one child, but you've heard several voices of teachers already. And the teacher goes on to say, everything that I have seen on our list here, meaning at the conference, are things that we're doing, but we have to look at children mentally, physically, before you can do anything academically. A fourth teacher goes on to say, it's our responsibility to respond to the whole child. It doesn't matter if they start, where they start, it's our responsibility to take them forward from where they need to go. The numbers go on. The feedback from teachers goes on. And one teacher writes that she estimates that over 80% of the day of administrators are spent on finding absenteeism with children, discipline situations, contacting families, arranging meetings, so they have empathy with what administrators are dealing with. And then a sixth one, and this will be the last one that I share, but I have so many. If students' needs are not being met outside the classroom, then we have got to find a way to meet them so that they can be able to learn and go forward. So road teachers are telling us, when we take the time to listen, and Barnett can tell us statistically, over 87,000 people in our state are certified educators, such as myself. Mm-hmm. There are many of us out there that can help contribute to the conversation. We hear about professional development needs. So often professional development, which is language for educators, is the training that you receive.
Right.
So often that could be deficit-minded. Why don't we value what teachers can offer to one another? Teachers want to learn from other teachers. Our first-year teachers want to have a mentor that can meet them where they are and not go through a calendar that's required and boxes that have to be checked off. Teachers can articulate what they need. And when they articulate that to us, it's our responsibility to respond and align the right resources for them to receive.
I can tell you, listening to these teachers, these educators, and these stories is alarming for me as a parent of 3 children, 2 school-aged children.
Yes.
I want to find out from you, what does it mean for you to hear these stories?
I have so many lenses. I'm a grandmother. I have a grandson in school already. I have a daughter who teaches. My family is all in education. Of course, I'm an educator. So the stories that we're seeing now aren't necessarily unusual with what has been seen before years ago, but because of the COVID pandemic, we know now that there's a different conversation. So teachers need to have a different audience to listen. We need social workers. We need guidance counselors in schools. We need time for our teachers to be prepared. We need time for our teachers to have a chance to collaborate with one another. We need resources readily available and break this agrarian cycle of what schooling has been designed to work on. The industrial creation and structure that we have, it's time for us to change it.
So, Barnett, what's the issue? Why can't we do this? What's the problem? What's the holdup?
I think there are 2 major pieces. One, there is a technical know-how of how to change the school structure, how to work with different agencies inside the education system, how to develop teachers as leaders. These are all technical issues that need to be addressed. But the biggie is mind shift. We still are so wedded to schools as they were when we ourselves were students in said schools. We've got to break through that in a big way. Educators are ready for it. The teachers with whom Christina and I met with our team are demonstrating there's more innovation coming out of our classrooms than we actually have realized. We're not utilizing our teachers as leaders the way we need to. If we want whole child education, where every child's needs are met and the family is integral to the process, and parents and kids have more choice in their learning and how they learn, and that's part of whole child education, we've got to reimagine the teaching profession, and we've got to have a system of teacher leadership.
Barnett, you have just written a paper on teacher leadership based on this research, and the paper was part of the deliberations of the recent International Summit on the Teacher Profession. Tell us a little bit about what you've learned from this project.
Well, the paper had 2 parts to inform the deliberation of the ministers of education and the union leaders from about 20 different countries from around the world, many of them top performing nations like Singapore, like Finland, or Canada. And so we drew upon a number of lessons, but we also drew upon some emerging evidence of how teachers were leading all across the globe. But we also more carefully documented how some of these top performing nations support their teaching profession and a system of teacher leadership. And there are several components, and I'm going to quickly run them down for us here today. The first one is teachers are paid well. They're not rich. They don't get rich in Singapore and Finland, the top performing jurisdictions in the world, but they're paid on par with as other professionals with like-kind degrees in education. U.S. teachers are paid 60% of what other like-kind professionals with their education earn in the United States. That's number one. The second major anchor for these systems, these top-performing systems when it comes to teachers and their leadership, is that everyone's well prepared. We don't have opportunities for, in 2 weeks you're a teacher all by yourself and lonesome sort of situation, which is common in the States. It's totally unheard of in these nations. And the way they do this is they invest more in teacher education, and this is how they afford to do it. First of all, they pay for teacher education for all their prospective recruits. And then they expect them to teach for 5 years, and they provide them strong working conditions, professional working conditions, and guess what? They never leave. Only like 2 or 3% teachers leave in those countries. That allows them to really deepen the investment in teachers. In fact, we spend less money than we do because we have such high teacher turnover rates.
Right.
And there are 3 or 4 other pieces that are really important. Teachers have more time to lead outside the classroom because they teach far fewer hours than teachers here in the States. Most teachers in these top performing jurisdictions, have somewhere between 10 to 15 hours a week to work with their colleagues, to work with families, to work with parents, to work with social service agencies out inside of their workday. And they are able to do this because most administrators in these systems also teach, and they're very creative with their curriculum, and they are very creative with their school day and school year.
This is really good. We are still exploring this as we are continuing to have this conversation with this vodcast, and we're going to dig more into that as we continue to have this conversation. Thanks, Barnett and Christina, for joining us for episode 2 of Elevate Ed for SC. You've given us a lot to think about today, and that's why we're here, to elevate the conversation about real transformation in education and what it would look like. We've got more lively and engaging conversations like this coming your way this season. Make sure to connect to elevateed.com for this episode's show notes. Follow us on social media at ElevateEd, the number 4 SC, to tell us what you think about what we've discussed today. Drop us a DM or visit us at our website. Make sure to shoot us an email. And if you're a podcast listener, please subscribe through Apple or Spotify and leave us a 5-star review. I'm asking you to do that. Leave us a 5-star review. Elevate Ed for SC is a production of U of SC's College of Education and College of Information and Communications in partnership with All for SC and the Tri-County Cradle to Career Collaborative. You've been elevated. See you next time.